Hello and welcome to my first ever YouTube video. I have been wanting to do this for a few years now at this point, and I just never actually sat down to do it. But I've been wanting to ever since I got back into reading, which was in, I think, 2021. I was one of those kids who just read constantly and then got so burned out from school that I just stopped for a long time. But then in 2021, I was on vacation and I picked it back up and I just never stopped. And I tend to be one of those people who reads a lot, and I feel like I have a lot of things to say about what I read. So I've always wanted to make videos just to find other people who've read the same things or have the same opinions about the book world right now. So January 2024 is finally the time that I'm doing it. I am Nova, and this is Off My Rocker Reading. I'm kind of recovering from a cold, so I'm sorry if I sound a little bit stuffy. I guess you don't know what my voice sounds like anyway at this point, but today I really want to talk about the best books that I read in 2023, which is kind of funny for me because I'm a hater. I'm a hater to my core. So the fact that I sat down and looked at my reading year and I wanted to talk about the best books that I've read is kind of funny to me. Because I'm a hater, I do want to do it with a little bit of a twist. So instead of just talking about the books that I thought were the best that I gave 5 stars, I also want to talk about the books that I expected to give 5 stars and that for one reason or another, I ended up not giving 5 stars. And that reason might be because of who wrote it. It might be the hype surrounding the book. It might just be that I started the book and it started off really strong and then I felt like it just kind of fizzled out by the end. So I want to talk about the books that I gave 5 stars, but then I also want to talk about the books that just barely missed it and got 4 stars. And I know that everyone rates books differently and that it's very subjective and that really it's hard to rate something like an entire novel on a 5-star scale. So just to establish how I've rated these books, for me, for a book to get 5 stars for me, I have to have liked it. There are a few that I give 5 stars just because I think it deserves it, but like I didn't particularly resonate with the story, but I like it and I look at the book once I finish it as like a piece of art and I determine if there was anything wrong with it, essentially. So for something to get 5 stars from me, it basically means that I feel like there was nothing wrong with this book. There couldn't have been anything better about this book. The author didn't like fumble in any way. Like this was like the most perfect that this thing could be, right? Okay, so without further ado, I'm looking at my notes here and I read 127 books last year, which is pretty normal for me, I would say. And on this list, I have 15 5-star books to talk about and 8 books that I feel like missed the mark and ended up getting a 4. One last disclaimer before I start, these are just in chronological order. I went through my like Goodreads year of my books back to the beginning and just took stuff as I saw it. So these are not like ranked. They really couldn't be ranked. I do have a few favorites and I will like mention it if I consider it one of my favorites for the year. The first book that I want to talk about today was a really sweet little feel-good coming-of-age story that I've never seen anybody else talk about. I think I just found it randomly on Goodreads, but that is Toffee by Sarah Crossan. This is a really sweet little story about a girl who runs away from home. I think she has like a strained relationship with her mother or something, but she runs away from home and she ends up in the shed on this property and is found by the old lady who lives in the house. And the old lady is suffering from dementia, essentially. I think it goes into it more in the book, but she's losing her memory and she's kind of mixing things up. And so she mistakes the girl in the shed for her friend that she had as a young woman named Toffee. So the whole time she's calling this girl Toffee, and I don't remember what her name actually is, but I think she just kind of goes along with it and they like start this little relationship. And it was just a very sweet story. I don't get emotional very much when I read. I don't find that I cry a lot during books, and I feel like this was one of the books that got me the closest to that point last year. The other really cool thing about this book that makes it very readable and consumable is that it's actually written in verse. So it's a novel, but the author wrote it in verse. And I thought that was like a really cool choice because it just flowed really well. It made the reading experience really quick. I just wanted to keep reading and keep reading and keep reading because I was reading these like verses instead of reading prose. The next book I want to talk about is kind of one that I have personal interest in the subject matter, so I know that this is not going to be a 5-star read for everybody. That is The United States of Cryptids by J.W. Ocker. Ever since I was like 8 years old playing Pop Tropica with my brother, we were obsessed with the Cryptids Island, and the Jersey Devil scared the hell out of us every single time. But I feel like ever since that moment, I've had just a little affinity for learning about different cryptids, which if you don't know what that is, that's just like Bigfoot and Mothman and stuff, right? But this author did a really cool thing. He just kind of I believe it's a man. Actually, I don't know because it's just initials. But the author did a really cool thing. They just kind of compiled all the major cryptids in North America, I think just North America, that they could find. And it was really good. The only thing that I will say is it's definitely, I would describe it more like a coffee table book, really, at the end of the day, because it's really cool. It has like illustrations for each cryptid, but it really is just name of cryptid, illustration, chapter about cryptid, name of cryptid, illustration, chapter about cryptid. Like, it just kind of, it gets repetitive if you're gonna sit down and read it all at once. I think that it's more the kind of book that like you have on your coffee table and you can just pick it up and flip to a chapter and read about one cryptid for the day. You know what I mean? But I do think that it was really well done. It was really well written, and I just personally loved it. The next book I want to talk about might have actually been the only children's literature that I read last year. I really love children's novels, so I try to read a few of them a year, but I dropped the ball last year, and I can't even think of one besides this one. But it was a really, really good one, so I'm happy that I read it. And that is Snow and Rose by Emily Winfield Martin. This is just a cute little retelling of the fairy tale Snow White and Red Rose, which is a little bit of a lesser known fairy tale. I actually don't know the original story of that one, but this retelling is just about the two little girls. They live in a cozy little cottage in the forest with their mom. Their dad has disappeared and they don't know what happened to him, but it's very cozy and whimsical. It's really just their little adventures day to day of going and meeting different creatures in the forest and finding different places to go. My favorite location that they went to was a library of trinkets and objects, and they could like check out one of the trinkets and objects and it would like end up helping them later on. So just very whimsical, very cute, nothing too serious or heavy. We do end up finding out what happened to the father, and it's like a happy ending, like fairy tales should be. So it was a very sweet little book. I would definitely recommend it if you just want like cozy cottagey vibes. I think that it's a really good story for that. This might be a weird comparison, but it kind of reminded me, you know, the Night Circus, and how that book is like so popular. Like, I'm sure like everybody's read that book at this point, but the way that the author describes the like just like whimsical magical details in that book, I feel like this is the equivalent of that, but in like a kid's book. So I think it's great. I recommend. Okay, the next one I'm going to talk about is no surprise to anybody. It is a book that was very, very hyped last year, but really for good reason. Like, I do think hands down it deserved 5 stars. That is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. Look, what can I say? It was really good. If you don't know what this book is about, it's, I believe, set in the 60s, and it is a woman scientist who kind of accidentally ends up having a cooking show. And it's very funny. It's written in a very witty, funny way, but it manages to talk about really important topics like inequality in the workplace at the time, and single motherhood, and grief, and, you know, a lot of heavy things, but it manages to make those topics something a little bit more consumable and at times funny. So there is some heavier subject matter, but I do think that it's handled in a really good way that makes it easier to read, even if it is like one of your trigger warnings, you know? This is one of those books for sure that I felt like I watched it and I didn't read it. I watched it in my head, you know? And the dialogue is so funny and well written. It really did deserve all the hype that it got. And I know that they made it into a show now. I'm kind of debating if I want to get Apple TV just to watch it. So like, if you've seen it and you thought it was good, let me know. Okay, this one's a little bit funny that I have on my list because, to be totally honest, I do not remember really any of the plot at this point. I remember it being really good, and I remember liking it and knowing that it deserved 5 stars. I gave it 5 stars. It's a pretty hyped up book. I feel like if you walk into Barnes & Noble, you're gonna see this book. So I do feel like it deserves the hype, but that is Lilac Girls by Martha Hall Kelly. The summary of the plot is that it's a World War II novel. It's kind of the interweaving of 3 different women's stories and how they end up crossing paths and impacting each other's lives. It was really well written. It was a great story. I remember, I guess it didn't stick with me enough that I remember a lot about it at this point, but honestly, I do think that is more a fault of mine and not the book itself. I kind of dropped the ball with historical fiction again last year. I feel like I didn't read a lot of it, and I usually try to because I like historical fiction, but this might have been really the only one that I read, and I know that it's a series, so I might continue it or even like go back and reread this one. But yeah, that is Lilac Girls. If you're into historical fiction, stories about women, World War II, this is definitely like one that you need to read. The next book is a young adult fantasy novel, I believe. And to be honest, this is one of those examples of a book that I know deserves 5 stars. The writing was amazing. The world that the author created was amazing. The plot was amazing. It really is just a matter of, I don't tend to read a lot of young adult fiction, and I don't tend to read a lot of fantasy at this point. So I read it and I really liked it, but it didn't personally like resonate with me a ton. But since I read it, I've seen one of my favorite booktubers, Carrie, ended up talking about it, and I believe she really liked it too. I think if you're into this kind of book, it's one that you should read, and maybe even if you're not. Oh gosh, I don't even think I said what it is, but that's Little Thieves by Margaret Owen. This is very much, again, fantasy, but I would even say like kind of like fairy tale vibes. The main character is the goddaughter of Death and Fortune, I think after her mom left her in the woods as a baby. But as she grows up, she kind of becomes a little bit of a grifter, kind of like a, I don't know, she's tricky and sneaky, and she ends up stealing the identity of Princess Genevieve, who she was Princess Genevieve's handmaiden, I believe, and she steals her identity and kind of turns the tables, and she's the princess, and Princess Genevieve is like her handmaiden. I need to double check that as a fact, actually. I'm not totally sure that's correct. It was just really good. It was a really good world. It ends up being kind of a high stakes story because she ends up getting cursed, and there's just like this big heist, and there's like this kind of awful prince character that Genevieve is supposed to be marrying that now like she might have to marry and everything. And it just, yeah, it was really good. It just wasn't personally my kind of story, but I would definitely recommend it if this is your thing. The next one I want to talk about is kind of a random one. It's by an author who I believe mostly does poetry, but this piece I would not really say is a poetry collection. It does have like the length of that and the readability of that. But before I get ahead of myself, the name of it is Marigold and Rose by Louise Gluck. I really liked this. I saw a lot of like negative reviews about it. I think people just kind of consider it like frou-frou and frivolous kind of. It is the story of 2 baby girls told from their perspective, Marigold and Rose. It's a piece about their first year of life and their the way that their personalities develop, the way that their language develops, their perception of time, their relationship to mom and dad. Not everybody is gonna like this. I do understand that conceptually. I think it just struck a personal chord for me. I liked the way that the author portrayed maybe the thoughts that are going on in these like little infants' lives. So I thought it was very sweet. Again, it's basically, it has the readability of like a short poetry collection. So if you're just like kind of curious about it, I would give it a go. The next book that I want to talk about is a really good, important, impactful nonfiction book that I read this year. I'm just going to read the title because it's kind of long, but that is Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. This is basically a nonfiction book about the data gaps that exist in women's lives as it relates to not being taken seriously in the medical world, as it relates to unpaid labor, as it relates to everyday objects not being tested on women, how there are not studies done on women. It's just full of such powerful and important information that I think really helps to drive home the reality of the patriarchy and how that affects women in such subtle, minute ways every day of our lives, because that's just what our society has been built on. I think that everybody should read this book, especially women. I think that it just helps to be educated on these topics, especially in a world right now where I feel like there's a lot of like anti-feminist rhetoric. I think it's important to be equipped with real, solid information and statistics and studies. Yeah, this is just a book that everybody should read. Highly, highly, highly recommend. The next book that I want to talk about might have been my favorite for the entire year. And I'm mad that it's not getting as much hype as it deserves, because it was definitely nominated for one of the Goodreads awards and it did not win. And I have not seen anybody talking about this book. I think I watched one person in like a best books of the year talk about this book. So that is The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. This book is so hilarious. It is set in a village in India, where there are these women who are business associates to a certain extent. I don't remember the ins and outs of that, but it's a group of women who kind of are all in on this like loan or business or something. The main character, her husband was just kind of a deadbeat. He was abusive. He just sucked. And like 5 years previous, he ran off. But everybody in the town, in the village, thinks that she killed him. She didn't. He just ran away. But everybody thinks that she killed him. So she's kind of a little bit of an outcast. And then eventually, as the plot progresses, the main character is approached by one of the women in this business group that she's in. And this woman confides in her that her husband sucks. Her husband is also abusive and sucks. And she wants the main character's help in killing him. And it's just very satirical. This whole plot kind of snowballs, and all these women end up forming, tenuous bonds and friendships surrounding this idea that men suck and all their husbands suck, and, they're abused and they're forgotten and their opinions aren't taken seriously. It was just a thoroughly enjoyable read, and I wish more people were talking about this story because it is so, so, so good. I feel like this year I read a lot of women-centric books that ended up being really good, because I'm looking at my notes, and the next one that I have to talk about is one of the other books that I would consider to be my absolute favorites for the year, and that is My Murder by Katie Williams. I have beef about this book. When it was marketed to me, I thought that it was going to be kind of a cheap thriller, which for me personally is my guilty pleasure. I could just read like a cheap, silly thriller every day of my life. So that's what I thought going into this book. And just to give a kind of a brief synopsis of what it's actually about, it's about a woman who was killed by a serial killer in this city, along with like 3 or 4 other women. And because of the technology that exists at this point in time in this novel, the 5 women that were killed by this serial killer have been cloned and are able to live their lives again, because the cloning initiative that exists in this world decided to bring them back. There was a whole campaign about bringing these women back. And our main character is brought back as a clone of this woman who was killed. And, you think everything's great. And she gets to live her life with her husband and her one child, one daughter, one child. And, you think everything should be happy, but then there are things that are just like not fully adding up about her murder. Like, why does she have a go bag in the closet with all her important papers and stuff? Why is her dad not talking to her anymore? And if this was a normal, cheap thriller, it would end up being like, oh, the husband actually killed her, right? That is not what happens in this book. Let me just tell you, this book really just decided to dissect so many important topics for women today. It talks about the way that technology dehumanizes us and women specifically. It talks about the way that true crime dehumanizes us and women specifically. There is some interesting stuff on the ethics of like cloning and all that, but I would say that that takes a more minor role in this book, which I think is good and is done effectively. But really, the way that it dissects the topic of women's worth largely being ascribed to how good they are, whether they're educated and have a career and married and they have a husband and they have kids, and how women alone are not worthy a lot of the times in the eyes of society. It's more about what benefit they bring to the other people in their lives instead of just their worth as an individual. And at the end of the day, with the twist and everything that ends up happening at the end of the book, it really is a book about women being allowed as people to make choices independent of the people that they're married to, independent of their children, independent of their family members, how women are worthy and can make choices that just benefit them and their interest. And I truly think that the hate on this book that I have seen, this book is not rated well on Goodreads. And I truly think that is by people who are misogynistic or who have internalized misogyny, because they don't like reading this story about a woman who is trying to find out answers just for her own self-interest. This book is so much more than just like a cheap thriller. It unpacks so many important things. And I think I read it like right after seeing the Barbie movie. So with all of that kind of fresh on my mind, this book just like, it was just so poignant to me. I really think that it should be read by anyone and everyone. The next book that I have to talk about is one of the memoirs that I read last year. I really love memoirs. That's one of my favorite genres. And this one is another one written by a woman. It's her story, which is crazy because it is a wild story, but it is called Striptease by Kate Flannery. This is her memoir about being a young millennial woman at the time that American Apparel was a really big deal, but at the time when it was also a cult. Did anyone know that? I did not know that, okay? But she talks about working for this company and just the abuse, the exploitation, the sexual exploitation that went on behind the scenes, the control, the pressure to live a certain lifestyle as being a young woman working for this company. Following her trauma was so interesting because you really watched the way that she just kind of justified like continuing to work for this company because they were so like controlling, and that's like what she knew at that point in her life. And they made it feel like a privilege to be able to work for them. But the things that she was pressured into, and how, oh, it's okay for us to take pictures of you two girls kissing in a bathtub, and maybe we'll use them someday and maybe we won't. Just really messed up stuff, and just crazy that it is a true story, and this is what happened to this woman. The next book that I want to talk about is definitely another one of my absolute favorites for this year, and that's Sirens and Muses by Antonia Angress. This is a book about the relationships between a handful of art students that go to this art school. It is a very beautiful, heart-wrenching story about students and their art and the way that they interact with each other and how they fall in love and how they become enemies. It's a really nice peek into like the art world and what it takes to like be part of that, because one of the characters is a man who is an artist, and now he is kind of like burned out, and he ends up going around and like doing talks at colleges and stuff. But as far as like his actual art goes, he feels like very stunted. So he's one of the main characters. There's 2 girls that are main characters, and then there's one guy. He sucks, but he's a good character. And it is so well written. It is so well done. I think I got 30 pages into it and I was like, this is so good. This is one of my top books this year. I think that this author just managed to make these characters so lifelike and realistic, and the things that they felt, I have also felt, and the things that they're going through, I have also gone through, even though I'm not an art student in 2006 or whatever. It really is just about like the human experience and the relationships that we develop and that we have. The next one, I don't have a ton to say about it because it was kind of short, but that is Another Brooklyn by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a pretty short novel set in the 70s. And it is kind of a coming of age story about this very diverse group of young women who are best friends and the way that they experience their coming of age all together, essentially. We do see them when they're older. I can't remember if it starts out with them older and then it flashes back, but either way, we get them like when they're younger and the experiences that they had together and their friendships, and then we get to like see what ended up happening to them later on. It was just largely about how growing up affected them as young women, how their relationships with men affected them as young women. And it was really well written. It was really a really good story of female friendship. It's a pretty short read. It's pretty consumable. So I would definitely say like pick it up for sure. The next book that I read is actually the sequel to A House of Salt and Sorrows, I think it's called, by Aaron A. Craig. The sequel is called House of Roots and Ruin. Oh my god, this book blew my mind. I think it was also young adult fantasy, which is funny because I just said like that's not really my vibe anymore. Oh my gosh, but I ate this book up. I ate it up. It was so good. So this is kind of an adjacent novel. It is like, oh, it's the second one in the series, but it doesn't follow the same characters. So the main girl in the first book, it actually follows her younger sister instead. The younger sister is an artist, and she is commissioned through the grapevine, I think, to paint the portrait of this young man at this estate in like another city, right? And her sister does not want her to go, and she runs away to do it anyway. She goes to Bloem, I think it's called, kind of like Bloom, because it's like the flower city, right? But not in like a cheesy way. I just want to say, such good world building for such like simple topics. Like the first city that we were introduced to in the first book is like, oh, salt and sorrows, and it's like the ocean and stuff. And then like Bloem is like flowers and pretty, but they're so well written. They're not cheesy at all, because I have a cheese radar, okay? I cannot stand that. And this, it's so well done. So she goes to this city that's like, oh, flowers, and it's so beautiful, and like the people are so kind and warm and yada yada. But there's also scary ghosts, scary things going on in this manor that she's staying in. Things that are not adding up about this boy that she is painting a portrait of, and things that are not adding up about his parents either. This book is so good. I don't want to say really anything more than that because I do think that it will start to spoil it. Read this book. Oh my gosh. In this time of fantasy being so hyped, I can't believe that this book has not gotten more traction than it has. I do know that it was nominated for maybe the romantasy category or the young adult category for the Goodreads Choice Awards, but it did not win, and it deserved to. It was so good. It does end on a cliffhanger though, and the third book is not out. So if you want to read it, maybe don't read it right now because I'm dying waiting for the next one. Oh man, the next book I want to talk about, very, very different vibe from really the rest of them that I've talked about to this point. That is The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. Ooh, okay. Just immediate disclaimer. This is like a horror book, not only in the sense of there is like body horror, there are like, you know, monsters and magic and yada yada. Not only that, and ghosts, there's ghosts too. Not only that though, it's just it deals with really scary, heavy topics that are very pertinent to today that I don't want to be too specific about because I think that that kind of spoils it a little bit. The brief synopsis that I will give you is that it is set in Victorian England. There is a magic system where people who are able to pierce the veil, not the band. The people who are able to open up the veil in this world are born with violet eyes and they're able to access like the other world, right? But just like everything else, it was originally, I think, a woman-dominated trait to have these violet eyes. But of course, that basically made these women a commodity. And now people are trying to essentially purchase these young women to marry their sons so that they can have children with violet eyes, and now they have access to this magic. There are a lot of trigger warnings for this book. I would just say that before you think about picking it up. Definitely look at those, because yeah, it deals with some really, really heavy, gruesome things that I think are just made even more heavy and gruesome because they are still such big conversations that we're having in our lives today. That's the most that I want to say about it. If you're up for reading this kind of book, I recommend, because there's a lot of things that I'm not saying because I don't want to give too much away. So if you're curious, read it. Okay, this is the last 5-star read that I want to talk about. And this is another one where I know that not everybody's gonna agree. I don't remember what the rating was on Goodreads, but I know like this is not a universally loved book by any means. This is just a book that works for me. And that is Woman Eating by Claire Coda. Look, I know that this book is not going to work for everyone because it is one of those books where not a lot actually happens. It's kind of just more, we're in the main character's head the entire time. But if you like books about young women and female rage and female sadness, then this is a great book. It's about a young vampire who is trying to survive in the real world, independent of her very controlling mother. Her mother, she has put into a home because she's having trouble remembering things. She's been alive for like hundreds of years at this point, I believe. And she's kind of losing her grip on her memory and reality. So the main character puts her in a home and she just kind of gets out of there. She rents a studio, an art studio, and she's working on her art, and also working at this art gallery. And this book, listen, nothing happens, but at the same time, so much happens. And it deals with so many topics. It deals with like self-esteem, her mother's self-esteem, and how her mother kind of instilled this very, very low sense of self-esteem into her. It deals with being like biracial and just tensions there in her life. There's a lot about abuse of power and an imbalance of power in relationships, which I think is a really big conversation topic right now. There's also just a lot about the art world and what she ends up creating and her relationship to herself and her being a vampire. Look, this book is not going to be for everybody. I know that. It works for me, and if you like anything that I just mentioned, read it. So that was all of my 5-star reads. My voice is hoarse at this point. And now I want to talk about the ones that missed the mark for me. And I know there are some hot takes in here, okay? I am aware. I think I have 8 of these to talk about. And the first one is Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott. This book, it had so much potential. And it started off so strong. And I feel like it just kind of lost the way by the end. It felt like the author had such a strong vision of what she wanted it to be, but didn't know how to resolve the conflict at the very end. This is basically a modern, dark fairy tale that comes from Eastern European folklore. So like if you know like Baba Yaga, it's basically her descendants inherit Baba Yaga's house, which if you know from the story, Baba Yaga's house is alive and has chicken legs, and it's called Thistlefoot. So these siblings, these estranged Yaga siblings, inherit Thistlefoot and have to come together to figure out what to do with it and to do about it. But there is this really creepy, evil villain figure that's kind of following them, and they call him the Long Shadow Man, and he's trying to take the house. He's trying to get to the house. I don't remember why, to be totally honest, but what a creepily written villain. Like, the scenes of him before he ever interacts with the main siblings are just like so tangibly creepy and like really just like, oh, like gave me like chills. But in the meantime, before this villain ever reaches them, these siblings decide that they're going to do one last tour of their family's like traveling theater show. So like think like marionettes and puppets. The characters were so good. The two main characters and then like the other supporting characters that they meet along the way were so good, and their relationships and the way that this like brother and sister relationship like healed over the course of the book was so good. I loved it. And this was the only book that actually, the ending of it, the very ending of it, where everything's like resolving, actually did like make me emotional. It made me cry. However, my biggest complaint about this book is that this villain is set up and he's so creepy and he's such a good villain, and you think it's going to be like this very high stakes ending of like, how can they possibly like overcome this villain? How can they defeat him? You think that it's building up to something so good and so amazing, and then it's just so anticlimactic at the end. So anticlimactic. Like, just the way that they end up defeating him was just so kind of easy, and it bothered me. And it makes me wonder if he was just almost like too good of a villain. Like if the stakes were too high and defeating him was going to require something impossible, that like there was really no good way to do it that was going to be satisfactory. The next one I want to talk about is not a book that I've ever heard anybody else talk about, but it is Search by Michelle Hunovan. I don't know if I'm saying that right. This is a book about a woman author who is trying to come up with the idea for her next book, and she ends up being a part of a church committee, this church that she goes to. She ends up being part of the church committee to find a new minister. But she goes to this Universalist church. So there's lots of different beliefs. It's very diverse. And I think that the biggest strength of this book was like its characters. The characters and the conversations that they were having in this little committee and how they were like determining what minister to choose and everything. I just thought they were so diverse. They were so realistic. There was so much like representation and important conversations going on. I think the other thing for me is that it just felt like so like homey and nostalgic for me, because I grew up in the church and I don't go to church anymore, but that like really like feeling of like safety and comfort really shone through in this book and like made me want to like go to a church again and like bring muffins. Do you know what I mean? Like it's so like cozy and homey and like everybody felt like family almost. But yeah, I think the fault of this book was just again like the ending. Like I found the ending to just be kind of sad almost. Like it was just a little unsatisfactory. I think we had spent so much time sitting with these characters and having conversations with these characters that like in the end, after the committee has like broken up, they kind of just all dispersed and went back to their normal lives. It just wasn't like the like big happy family kind of ending that I think you kind of expected. And maybe that was the point, that it was supposed to be like a little more realistic, but I feel like it just was kind of a blow. Like it just kind of made me sad at the end. It was such a feel-good book that lacked a really feel-good ending. Okay. The next one that I want to talk about is a little bit of an annoying one. I read this and was just, I liked it, but I was not super impressed by the way that it went. But then I read this author's other book and hated it. So now this one is like slightly tainted for me, but that is Lone Women by Victor Laval. This was another one that just, the story had so much potential, and I feel like the way that it went, the trajectory that it took to the end, just like totally fumbled the bag. It was a great idea, and I just feel like the author like didn't really know where to take it. It felt like it was trying to be a very like women empowerment, like you know, girl power kind of novel, but like this is like written by like a man. And I feel like maybe it fumbled because of that, you know? Like maybe write about what you know, because it's not translating. Just to give you an idea of what it's about, it's a science fiction book set in like the bare, open, undeveloped American West. And we're following this main character who is a woman who has a mysterious steamer trunk that she never lets out of her sight, that she never lets anybody buy, that's always locked. We find out that she's like essentially a fugitive, and that she like killed her parents and like started a fire in her family home and like ran away. And now she's trying to be a lone woman on this, you know, these open plains and be a homesteader by herself in Montana. And we know that there's like more going on in the story, but we don't know like basically what like there's like one central mystery and everything, like the pieces will fall into place surrounding that. Well, that one central mystery, I just thought it was lame. Like what ended up happening, I thought was lame. I liked the main character. I liked the premise. It was very cool and atmospheric, and I really did feel what was going on. But yeah, the twist, man, the twist was just kind of lame. It just kind of ended up being lame to me. The next one that I'm going to talk about, I know is a hot take, because this was like one of the biggest books from last year, and that is Weyward by Amelia Hart. This book, I'm sure you've seen it everywhere at this point. I think it won 2 of the categories for Goodreads Choice, which is insane. It was good. Okay, let me give you the idea of what it's about. It is kind of a historical, but there's also like a magical element, and it is the interweaving story of these 3 generations of women in this one particular family. I just felt like I had read similar things to it, kind of. I could be wrong, but it kind of reminded me of another book that I read a few years ago that was a 5-star read for me, but it was called Daughters of Foxcote Manor. I think that was the book that I just felt like it gave me similar vibes to that, and I thought that that book did it a lot better. But I could be wrong about that, and I am going to reread Weyward. Right now I'm reading all of the Goodreads winners, and I'm going to do a video talking about them. So I do plan to reread it relatively soon. If I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong in making this comparison, I will amend this statement then. Look, I'm curious to see if my opinion has changed at all, and like if I just didn't absorb the story or something. Okay, this next one is tough because the premise is so good and it started out so good. I think that it broaches an important topic right now in a way that I haven't seen anybody else do. It just, again, I feel like in the action towards the end, it just kind of lost its plot a little bit, but that is Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. This is a horror novel basically about gay conversion therapy. It's set in Montana, I think, in this town where there is like this gay conversion place that is like the most famous one in the whole country. There's advertisements for it, and like the success rate is so high, and a lot of the like economy of the town involves this gay conversion place. And it really just follows one main character and her journey with this camp, but being somebody who's lived in the town. We kind of find out some information backwards, so it's hard to really summarize the plot, but it's just her, I think at like the end of this summer, and some things just aren't adding up, and some weird stuff starts happening to her, and we just follow her journey with that. It's a horror debut, and I think that maybe that could be the reason why it just became a little convoluted once it got to like the climax of the plot, and I just wasn't super impressed with the way that it ended up going and the way that it ended up being resolved. I think that that probably does have to do with the fact that it is a debut. So it's like, I don't know, I give it a little bit of a pass because of that. I also just felt like it was too long. I felt like the author was really stretching it towards the end. Like it was just taking too long. And I think it would have probably benefited from being shorter. This next one that I want to talk about, I really cannot recommend this book enough. The only fault that it has is that it was too long. But it was another memoir that I read. It's called Dancing with the Octopus by Deborah Harding. This is a memoir. And it is the story of this woman who experienced a crime. There was a crime committed against her when she was a young girl. I think she was like 13 or 14. And she was kidnapped by an older teenage boy who was kind of like a petty criminal at the time. But it details this really super traumatic event that happened with this young man. And it interweaves that incident with her childhood, which was also really fraught and abusive because of her relationship with her mother. So it is like, yes, this really super traumatic incident happened to me, but there was also like trauma already building and going on. And so we're following like these 3 different timelines because we have her relationship with her mother and different incidents that happened then also the night of her kidnapping and what happened during that night. And then we are also seeing her in the future as she's getting older, as she's getting married, as she's starting to have kids. We also see her get diagnosed with PTSD and the really difficult symptoms and things that were happening to her with that, and how she had to really advocate for herself and her mental health as it related to her relationship with her parents. I felt like it was really expertly crafted. The only failure that I really think that it had was that by the end, I felt like it was just being dragged out a little bit. I do feel like some of her musings and stuff probably should have gotten edited down a little bit. I think that she has a really important voice and this is an important story, but keeping me engaged as a reader was becoming like hard. It was just becoming harder and harder for me as it went on, because I kept feeling like we should be getting to the end, and then it was like, oh no, there's like 50 more pages, there's 30 more pages, there's, you know what I mean? So I would say that's its one failure, but I do think it's important as a reader to push through for the sake of this story. Something that I also found really crazy and admirable from the author is that she actually did go into the story of the young man who kidnapped her and like kind of what led him to that point, and then what ended up happening to him later, like as he was in prison and then afterwards, which I just think is so brave to do and really like added something to this story, like seeing that kind of what led him to do this was also the result of his own trauma. And that doesn't excuse it, but it does kind of explain where he was coming from, if such a thing can be explained, you know? So again, I would really, really, really highly recommend this book. You have to kind of slog through the end a little bit, but it is for good reward. Like, it is a really, really good memoir. Okay, I'm so sorry for the lighting. I had to take a little break to go get my dog from daycare, and now it's like getting dark outside because I live in Ohio, so I apologize for that. But this is the last book that I have to talk about, and it's maybe my biggest disappointment of the entire year because I really like this author and I was expecting to love this book. But that is Rouge by Mona Awad. I first read All's Well by Mona a few years ago, and I loved that one. And then I read Bunny, which is the one that's gotten the most hype, and I liked Bunny. I thought it was good, but I didn't like it as much. So when this was gonna come out, I was really excited, and I feel like, again, it was hyped up a lot. I was just seeing the cover everywhere. Everybody was just really excited to read it, and it kind of fell flat, I feel like. The thing too that I think is funny, like before actually getting into what it's about, is nobody can seem to make up their minds like what this story is. I have seen people say that it's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which I don't see at all. I have also seen people say that it is some like Greek tragedy or Greek myth retelling. I am not familiar with it, so I don't know. And it's like through like official channels too. Like I'm pretty sure the Goodreads synopsis says like Beauty and the Beast retelling. I might be lying, I might be making that up, but just saying, it's a little weird. This is essentially a gothic horror novel about a woman who comes home after her mom has sort of unexpectedly, accidentally passed away. And this woman has really low self-esteem, is really obsessed with skincare and looking young and perfect. And she comes home to find out that her mother was part of this weird, exclusive beauty club spa thing. And it's basically just her dealing with the fallout of her mom dying and also getting ushered into this club. this club that obviously has nefarious intentions for her. We flash back to her childhood and things that happened in her childhood, and she starts getting these treatments at this beauty spa thing, and basically like starts to like lose her grip on reality. Like essentially just descends into madness like women in Mona Awad's books tend to do, which usually I love and I eat it up. And I do think the detail that I really liked in this one was that she lost her grasp on language. So she started like replacing words with other words, and the other words were always like weird and like grotesque and negative. But to be honest, it felt long and like really like nothing happened. Like she goes and gets like a couple treatments at this place, and there's just all this kind of like weird in between stuff and weird stories like from her childhood. And then it all culminates in this big ending that, again, it was like the stakes are so high in this moment right now, and you just solved it by something so tiny and simple that it was annoying. The ending like annoyed me. Like I was just like, that's it. And it was all like, it was like written in really like atmospheric, like flowery language. So you didn't like fully really know what was going on. There wasn't enough like gripping me, and like there wasn't enough understanding on my end to be like connected to the story. Like I lost the thread that was like keeping me invested. As a whole, I just thought this book was really disappointing. And I'm sad because I like gothic horror, and this one just, but it just missed the mark. All right, but that is it. That is the last one that I wanted to talk about. So those were the best books that I read this year and the books that could have been the best ones that I read this year. Let me know what you thought if you made it to the end of this. I know this was a lot. Really, I just want to find like a community and see if other people think the same way about the things that I read. So, yay. Thanks. Bye.